You may begin.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is an open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. I'm Joshua Levy, Committee Chair. It's Wednesday, August 18th, 2021, and the meeting is being conducted remotely, consistent with the current state regulations, and is being recorded. Public access to the meeting does not ensure that there will be public participation unless it is required by law. This meeting will not have public comment except in connection with the first item of business, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. First, I will confirm that a quorum of the members of the Finance Committee are present. When I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. John Connolly.
Here.
Barry Kaufman.
Here.
James Healy.
Here.
Tom Jacob.
Here.
Rick Lunetta.
Here.
Louise Miller.
Here.
Dick Riley.
Here.
And Carol Fischetti.
Here.
Thank you. As a reminder, anything you share or state will be a matter of public record. As a preliminary matter, I would ask for a motion to continue the meeting to September 8th, 2021 in the event of a technical disruption this evening.
I make that motion.
Second.
We'll do a roll call vote. Carol?
Aye.
Dick?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
going out of order. Thank you, Barry. And the chair votes yes. So we get to the first item of business, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. If there's any resident who wishes to address the Finance Committee, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and we will call on you.
I am not seeing anyone.
Okay. Then we'll move to the second item, approval of minutes of the prior meetings. There are 4 items, the open session from June 23rd, 2021, and then the executive sessions from December 1st and December 9th, 2020, and from March 17th, 2021. Is there a motion to approve these minutes?
And there is. I'll move that we accept the minutes from the meetings you just described.
Second.
Okay. Just for the public, I want to give a brief background on the executive session minutes because I know we don't approve those very often. They just concern a potential property acquisition that was ultimately not pursued. The select board had initially identified the opportunity as a potential site for school administration. The Finance Committee was initially skeptical, but was willing to continue discussions for the narrow purpose as a site for school administration. The school committee subsequently indicated that did not support using the site for school administration. Discussions continued as to whether the property should be acquired for an unspecified future use, but the Finance Committee did not support that unspecified future use. So I guess we'll take a roll call vote on the minutes. John?
Yes.
Barry?
Yes.
Jim?
I have to abstain on a couple of those because I wasn't there. And since we're doing them as a group, I don't know which ones I wasn't there for. I know June 23, I wasn't available. The one in December, I had joined, as you remember, in mid-December. So why don't I just, for the sake of the argument, I'm going to abstain as to all.
Okay. Tom?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Louise?
Yes.
Dick? Come back to Dick and Carol.
Yes.
Okay. The chair votes yes. Dick?
You're
Are you
muted.
still on the-
He's muted.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so it passes 7-0 with one 8-0 with one abstention. Okay, so the first item of business is the reserve fund transfer. This involves the school department and the PPBC. Dave, if you could bring in the people involved with that. I'll give a brief introduction and then I'll hand it over to the people who are submitting this request. So on August 3rd, the school department submitted a reserve fund transfer request which would be undertaken in cooperation with the PPBC to extend the school master plan delivered by Doran Whittier in order to examine alternate or revised build scenarios for Pollard and Mitchell that aim to keep the borrowing costs within the town's debt limits by either spreading out the costs over a longer period of time or by reducing the project costs. The request would also update forecasted enrollment figures. The request is in the amount of $75,000, which would be supplemented by $25,000 in unused appropriations from an earlier study for a total of $100,000. We also received a letter from Doran Whittier describing the scope of work and estimating the cost at not more than $60,000, while also allowing for an additional $15,000 to be set aside for future work yet to be identified for a total of $75,000. So I'll hand it over, I think, to Dr. Gutekunst to discuss the reserve fund transfer in more detail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hope, please refer to me as Dan. I get anxious when I hear Dr. Gutekunst. Thank you. And thanks to the Finance Committee for, interrupting vacations. And I don't think that you're always planning to meet this week in August. So thank you very much for doing that. I will defer to Ian Galati for some specifics here. I think the big picture is that as we have had conversations about the school facilities master plan, it's become apparent with conversations with Finance Committee, Select Board, and School Committee that a review of the timeline, for example, for Pollard and Mitchell is appropriate because the option the school committee voted on is an enormous lift to the community financially. And we thought with some discussions informed by Finance Committee members, Select Board, School Committee, it made sense to have the designers pursue with some input from the town, for example, around capital financing and what that could look like, debt, et cetera. What it might look like if we elongated the timeline for Mitchell and Pollard, and what would be necessary to keep those buildings, working and alive, if you will, in the meantime. So that's the nature of the reserve fund transfer request. I think altogether it will provide $100,000 because I believe there's $25,000 left in the original article from the October 19, I think, town meeting. I think I have that right. And so, and Doran Whittier have also provided some information on how they would intend to use those funds. So with that, I think maybe as an overview, I turn it back to you, Mr. Chair, and if there are questions about that, I know that Ann or Hank or Steve Popper would be happy to try to answer some questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I guess I'll just start with one question with the math. So I think the intent is for a $75,000 transfer supplemented by the $25,000 left over. In the Doran Whittier statement, it said that the cost of the work would be $60,000, and then there would be an extra $15,000 as a buffer. So I'm just wondering why the request is for $75,000 rather than $50,000 to bring it to a total of $75,000.
And I'm going to defer to you on.
I actually would like to ask Steve or Hank to respond to that question. They've been in most close communication with Doran Whittier about the price of the study.
I think you're muted, Steve.
Steve, you're muted.
Good evening. So when we looked at the extension of the study based on conversations that had taken place between the school department, ourselves, and conversations within the FinCom. Initially, I was asked to come up with a number, and I thought a study like this, which is, as you probably know, there is no specificity to the scope. There are variables that will be coming up. There's and in this particular case, there's probably extensions and new areas of interest will come up as this particular study develops. I thought 500 hours was a reasonable number of man hours to assign. We then spoke with Durham Whittier. They looked at the scope as it was became more finalized in the request transfer. And they agreed to reduce the rate downward. The 75,000 is still a target. It's a reasonable target to be able to complete a study that could take different avenues and different iterations as it's developed. So that basically is the $75,000 that's been requested. The additional 25,000, which we have remaining from the original $190,000 study appropriation. Actually, it was a couple of appropriations that were combined for 190,000. We only were invoiced 165,000 from Durham Whittier, which allows us to have the additional 25,000. I suggest that we continue to keep that 25,000 in reserve so that we can complete all the particulars that will come through the study. So in essence, that's how we came up with the 75,000 request and the additional 25,000 that's in reserve.
Thank you. Hank, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, if I could also note that in the letter that Durham Whittier sent back on August 12th, I think that has been shared with you, they set aside $15,000 for cost estimating and some of their other sub-consultants that'll likely be needed. And they don't know exactly what that scope will be, but certainly as we look at variations, updated cost estimating will be necessary. And so that's the difference between the 60 and the 75. In all cases, they are treating this, as Steve said, at a discounted rate and also a not to exceed number. So, and in the facilities financing working group, there was also discussion about two other projects, which include Emory Grover and DPW. So I think that when Steve and I discussed this earlier, having 25,000 available to perhaps look at those in more detail would be beneficial, because questions may come back on delaying those projects as well.
Okay, thank you. Louise.
Thank you. Can we just get a little bit of a reminder of how we got here? How was this school study initially funded? And why is it that we're now requesting a reserve fund transfer rather than going to town meeting for continuation of the study? And I don't recall how the study was funded initially. So I think a little bit of history and reminder might be helpful. Thank you.
Do you have that information, Dan, regarding the original town meeting appropriation?
You know, I think the original town meeting appropriation was in fall town meeting of 19. Ann? You're on mute, Ann.
I think it was May of 20. T.
Fall in spring, okay.
Is it accurate to say that, so I think the finance committee first received the school master plan and discussed it with the school department in, I think, October 2020. And then since about May of 2021, there have been meetings with the facility financing working group composed of members of the select board, school committee, finance committee, and PPBC. And we've been discussing, well, we've been looking at debt forecasting scenarios for rebuilds for Pollard and for Mitchell, assuming rebuilds as well for Emory Grover and for DPW, as well as other identified capital costs. And I think over the course of those meetings during the summer, it seemed that the scenarios C and D, which were examined in the most detail, would exceed the debt limits for the town over several years. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the impetus for this reserve fund transfer is to try to find alternate scenarios or scenarios with reduced scope that would help fit Mitchell and Pollard into the debt limits that the town has set up. Is that a correct characterization, Dan?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So why is this through a reserve fund transfer?
It was suggested by the group, the facility study group, that it would be helpful to learn sooner rather than later what a timeline or what a different scope, if you will, of these projects would be, rather than waiting on town meeting.
Okay.
Jim, go ahead.
One of the things that I think is important is that the facility financing plan, of course, comes from the finance director as approved through the Board of Selectmen. But there's a lot of involvement, especially from the finance committee. And I will be honest that it sounds to me like nobody likes the results of the initial capital requests that were submitted. And so we realized we have to go back to the drawing board, and which is all fine. I agree with all that. But now we're going to pay X amount of dollars to an outside vendor to kind of weigh in on that. And I guess maybe that's fine. Maybe that's perfect. Maybe that's exactly what needs to be done. But I don't want anyone to think that because we have a third-party vendor now weighing in on what really is a town decision with respect to facility financing, that somehow that's going to supplant or take away from the prerogative of the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, town manager, and the finance committee. So I don't want anyone to say, hey, we've solved your problem, here it is. So if it's information that will inform the deliberations of all of our respective committees, including the finance committee, I think information is good and can help us. But I want to make sure that at least I voiced my opinion that this is not the end all and the be all. This is just information.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I agree with Jim and the way he just articulated it. I am concerned that, we got this letter from Dora and Whittier who says that they will cap it at 60,000 and suggesting another 15 for cost estimating or other things. That's 75. We already have 25. So why is it that we're asking for 75 instead of for 50? To go back to Josh's point at the very beginning, it seems to me that would be the appropriate amount. And to address Louise's point, I think at the time this was first raised back in July, the thought was there could be some quick things that could be done that would be good to get by Christmas time maybe. But now when this report, Dora and Whittier says they're going to need 6 months to do it, and involves not Emory Grover, but Mitchell and Pollard, which are both projects that aren't going to be happening immediately. you know, I'm more inclined to, or I'm inclined to agree with Louise that it should be a you know, a warrant article for our special town meeting on October 25th, in keeping with what the prior work was. Thank you.
Thank you. Hank, go ahead.
Yeah, it was trying to expedite the thinking process, as Steve mentioned. We don't have a direct target. We have some possible variations on the studies that have already been created. And so, as in any iterative process, it will also have to involve the Facilities Financing Working Group, and particularly Dave Davison, to make assessments. And what's most difficult about it is there's no single logarithm that can be used to input all of the multivariables that come into both cost estimating, the time, cost escalation over time, and the debt variation over time. Or maybe one of you has that expertise, but it will probably be an iterative process where we go through, look at several new scenarios. Dave takes those scenarios, looks at the financing, and then there'll be more scenarios coming out of those to try to balance the books moving forward.
Thank you, Hank. Are there other, oh, Dick, go ahead.
If there was an answer to John's question, I didn't hear it. And that is, this has the implications of emergency, time sensitive, but I haven't heard anything say why this is time sensitive. So help me on that one.
Dan or Hank?
Well, you know, I have to tell you, I'm a little frustrated to hear this conversation. And I'm frustrated because, respectfully, we have been working together now for several months, and it was members of the Finance Committee who suggested that we consider a reserve fund transfer. And now to hear that we should await again, yet again, let's put off again a conversation, let's put off again a plan, let's put off again a strategy, is very frustrating for me to hear. So we come to you with an earnest and an honest request for funds to help move this discussion along for the town on two very real needs. Yes, it's going to take some time to get this done, because it will be my intent that the Facilities Working Group, the Finance Committee, Town Meeting, Select Board, School Committee, everyone is as involved as possible and has an opportunity to weigh in. But to defer and delay again is frustrating to hear, and I hope the Finance Committee, even if it means you're only willing to fund $50,000, although I agree with Steve, it would be helpful to have that flexibility. I hope that tonight you can vote to support that request so that Dorn Whittier can provide the information that Mr. Healy discussed.
Go ahead, Ann. Ann, you can go ahead.
I think one of the reasons for the immediacy as well, one of the reasons for the immediacy is that although Dorn Whittier has estimated potentially 6 months, we aren't sure if this is going to take 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, or 12 months, in part because we're working in collaboration with the town finance manager, who's going to be doing these scenarios in addition to his regular responsibilities. So we understand that there's going to be more than simply consultancy involved here. I think in addition, we aren't quite sure how many iterations are going to be involved. So it's possible that $60,000 might be sufficient, but it is also possible that it could be closer to $100,000. So that was the reason, both for the amount as well, and there's an additional reason, both for the amount as well as the immediacy of the request.
Thank you. Louise, did you have your hand raised?
I did, thank you. I don't think I can vote in favor of this reserve fund transfer really for two reasons. One is I don't feel comfortable as a member of the finance committee funding something that normally is funded at town meeting. We normally fund studies, and we normally fund designs, those types of things at town meeting, unless there really is a time sensitive. There has to be some downside to waiting at like another 6 weeks at this point in time, because the money will become immediately available. I assume it's going to be cash. It will become immediately available. So I, for one, can't support it. I understand all of the arguments that are being made, but I worry that the reserve fund is supposed to be used for certain purposes only. And this is not one of the purposes of the reserve fund.
Jim.
I think we need to finally move forward. I think Ann Gulati is still in her office, and I see an aluminum radiator behind her, which was last used on the Honeymooners with Ralph Cramden. So we need to do something to move forward. So as much as I am a person who loves process and likes to do things, properly and correctly, if this vote allows us to finally get to a place where we can begin to understand and positively and effectively debate how we're going to handle Mitchell, Pollard, and Emory Grover within the next foreseeable years, then I think we need to do that. I don't know if the delay between tonight and the special town meeting is that catastrophic. I don't have the knowledge or the experience with that. But whatever we decide to do, whether we vote in favor tonight or whether we move forward at the special, we have to move forward. And I understand everyone's comments in the past, even though I wasn't on the finance committee until mid-December, but I do, I do pay attention, and I do keep abreast of what's going on. And I understand there's been a lot of excellent reasons why we are where we are today and still not moving forward. But we've got to get beyond it. Somehow we've got to get beyond it and figure out what's the best way to move forward. So I apologize. That's not really a very affirmative statement one way or the other, but it's what I feel. Thank you.
I guess I have another question for Dan. I think one of the reasons why we should vote for the reserve fund transfer is if we're not happy with any of the scenarios that we've already identified, and if we're committed to pursuing any of the alternate scenarios that are outlined in the reserve fund transfer. I think I'm not satisfied with the existing scenarios. I think they exceed all of our debt limits. I want to just clarify if the alternate scenarios that are going to be examined are ones that the department is comfortable pursuing in the long run.
I guess, and I noticed that my hand is raised on my screen. I didn't raise it, so maybe you have to unraise it for me. But in answer to your question, the school committee's goal ultimately is to renovate Pollard and Mitchell, reconstruct and/or renovate Pollard and Mitchell. That's their goal. And a path forward toward that goal is really what we seek. They did vote on option D, and at that time I said, your vote is the first step in a very long process. And it has been, and it will continue to be a long process. And And so I think with that goal in mind, of how we can reasonably renovate Pollard and or reconstruct Mitchell really remains the goal. And if there are new ways of looking at the problem, and by the way, we have to engage the MSBA as well. The sooner we do that, in some ways will be helpful, and that will be a conversation for later this winter when they open up the window, because they will also want to participate in this discussion. They're kind of another party that will be involved. But that's the goal, and a path forward toward that goal is really, I hope, what we can get toward.
I would prefer for us to come to a resolution. So I hope that these extra funds help in that, and it's not just getting more data for more data's sake, because I feel like we are kind of at an impasse, and we need to come to a resolution very soon. Barry, I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Jim just said. Honestly, I think option D, which was what it was agreed to, when we looked at the financing alternatives for that, I think we all balked because of the impact on the debt limits. My hope and understanding is at least this scenario, these funds will be used to come up with an alternative that will mitigate some of those issues potentially. Because the reality is I don't think we're comfortable going forward with the plans that was recommended. So I think I understand the process issue, but I do think it's imperative we move forward because it has implications for everything else that we want to do as well. The sooner we know it, the better. And I'm not going to get hung up on formality or process for an amount of this, for this amount of money in order to facilitate getting this process moving faster.
Carol.
Thanks. I agree with Jim and Barry, and I just wanted to clarify something in the materials that were distributed from Dorn and Whittier. They seem to suggest that they would be studying basically the ramifications or the kind of near-term indications of shifting enrollment on the plans that they had studied in the past. So to the extent that that provides additional information for us to make a better and more informed decision, I am supportive of the reserve fund transfer. I will say though that I would prefer to cap the amount of funds as needed, what you suggested of the 60,000. So I'm for reducing the amount from 75.
Thank you. Connie.
I support a lot of what has been said. In our meetings with the facilities group, it's clear that we have, someone used the word conundrum, and it is. We've not been able to move to find any path forward because of the amount of money, because of the effect on debt, because of the effect on the taxpayer. But we do need to move forward. And so the feeling is to postpone again. The school committee feels strongly that we need to move. And that's why I would hope that we're not going to postpone another 2.5 months or 2 months, waiting for town meeting and wondering again whether this is going to hopefully would pass, but it might not. We are trying to break a log jam. All of these very smart and intensely interested and folks who care about what happens in the schools have been working on this for some time and have not been able to find a path forward. So we need to do that. And that comes from the school committee and of course from administration.
Thank you, Connie. Rick.
I support what's said before. My hope is that truly this money is well spent, that indeed when they conclude what they'll ever conclude, that it will give us information enough to truly move forward. Whether it's 60, 50, 75, I'm prepared to move forward on the original request for the 75. And if truly that gives us what we need to take that next step, then I think this is well money spent. Question, if indeed that comes back and we're still in a standstill, what is plan, I was going to say B, but what is plan W?
Dan, do you have an answer?
I don't have an answer, but I don't know that I wouldn't use the words impasse or standstill or dead end with any of this, because in my now 16 years in Needham, every time there's been a problem, particularly as it relates to the schools, this community, and this finance committee in particular, along with the school committee, has figured out a way to resolve issues, problem solve, and make things happen. So it's a big lift. There are real needs, and we will figure them out. So I just think this one needs a little bit more baking in the oven in order to kind of present it to the community. And I think with the wisdom of this group and the school committee, we'll absolutely get there.
Thanks, Dan. Dick.
Yeah, I don't think there's any dispute that this money needs to be spent. Strike that money needs to be spent for the purposes outlined. I think there was and has been, I certainly raised it in my mind, a question as to the process and the immediacy, but I think this is as much an issue of perception as it is of reality. I don't think whether we approve it here as a transfer or do it later, it's going to cost us more or less money. So I think it's a push in terms of the economic consequences. So I think it comes down to a perception, and I'm concerned that if we vote against this, we may have somehow created the perception that we're not in favor of getting more information on the subject and getting to the bottom of this. So while I'm not thrilled with the fact that we seem to be stepping across the process a bit, I think on balance, it probably makes sense to approve it.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, a clarification, the statement. With respect to the clarification, I just want to make, as I understand it, the reserve fund transfer, as it was put together and presented to us by the schools and the Durham Whittier letter, none of this money would be going to Emory Grover and looking at anything about Emory Grover. It only has to do with Mitchell and Pollard and debt limits and enrollment and those types of things on a going forward basis over the next 5 to 10 years. I just wanted to clarify, that's my understanding. And if I'm wrong, I'd like to speak to Jim's point that none of this money, whether it's 50,000, 75,000, or 100,000, is going to the Emory Grover aspect of the conundrum. And if I'm wrong about that, I'd like to be told. Secondly, to Dan's point, I was the one who at one of the facilities meetings raised the reserve fund transfer, but I've always thought about it as something that we're going to do something quickly. And there's an immediate need and that we're going to get an immediate answer. And when I hear things like, well, Durham Whittier is going to take 6 months and it might take longer and things along those lines, that's not what I had in mind when I raised, and I know some others did, a reserve fund transfer. And so I don't quite think it's the same thing now as it's being articulated that what I had in mind when I first raised it. And that is my concern, that if it was something that we were going to be getting immediately, I'm much more comfortable on a reserve fund transfer than on something that is 6, 9, 12 months out. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I had the same understanding that this would focus on Mitchell and Pollard, those two buildings. Anne.
I would just concur that the study work that Durham Whittier does will focus on the educational facilities and not Emory Grover. However, the debt service analysis includes Emory Grover. So as those additional scenarios are built into the debt service analysis, Emory Grover will be, of course, as well as the DPW project and other town projects will be part of that analysis.
Thank you. Jim.
Just want to make sure, if I haven't been clear already, the debt service analysis is not Doran Whittier's. The debt
Correct.
service analysis is the finance directors as chimed in with by the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, permanent public building committee, and the finance committee. I'm in favor of moving forward to get more information.
Thank you. Connie.
Two things. One is I really hear what John is saying and appreciate that he did bring this up, but I saw it a little bit differently. I don't think we want a more rapid study than is going to be excellent. We really have a problem that we're trying to, and it's going to take some time for them to do that. Second is, there are people who do conflate the Emory Grover and the schools in town. And some of them serve on some of our boards and committees, and they are separate, but we just have to remember that some people lump them together and aren't as knowledgeable about it as the group that's speaking right now. So that's just something we have to be aware of. They put it all together in the schools. We just have to separate those two and make clear that we're moving in order to perhaps make folks accept the needed move for school administration. We have to be clear that we're moving forward on the schools for the children. Maybe a minor point.
Thank you, Connie. Louise.
So reserve fund transfers can only be made to operating budgets. So as I understand it, this is being made to the school department operating budget, in which case I think we should also have an assurance with respect to any remaining funds, and I would suggest capping them. My other question, Mr. Chair, can I make a motion and then vote against my motion? Is that a proper motion?
You can certainly do that. Before you do that, I actually had a similar procedural question for Dave.
Okay.
So in the document that I have, the request for reserve fund transfer, the certification of condition of account is not filled in, and there's no signature by the town accountant. Are we able to proceed and take a vote on that tonight without that information?
Yes, you are, and I apologize. I thought we got you an updated one because it actually changed the account number to a school department account number, and the town accountant did certify that. Depending upon and what it reads is based upon the appropriation of in shorthand 83.6 million. As of August 5th, 70 million was still available. This evening, I will forward the document to the chair to be DocuSign, which will be the document I just referred to, and you can indicate which way the Finance Committee votes. So the short answer to your question, yes, the Finance Committee can vote.
Okay, and this would be transferred to the school department?
It would be.
Okay, thank you. Louise, yeah, if you had a motion you wanted to make, go ahead.
I move that the Finance Committee vote in favor of the reserve fund transfer request made by, I guess it's the school department, in the amount of $75,000 rather than the amount of the request.
So just to clarify, the request was in the amount of $75,000. Were you seeking to reduce that?
I'm sorry, reduce it by $75,000, so $50,000 out of the reserve fund and $25,000 would be funded through leftover funds from a previous master plan.
Okay.
I second that motion.
Okay.
Is that a second that you are making but you don't agree with?
No, it's a second that I'm making because I agree with it, and I would be voting in favor of that motion.
Sorry.
Whereas Louise is making the motion and saying she's not going to vote in favor of it. I'm seconding it and saying I am going to vote in favor of it.
All right. I'm just trying to put a little levity into this. But Mr. Chair, if I could just say one thing, which is actually an interesting point. I think what Dave Davison just said, and it harkens back to my prior days in this life. It is unusual. Here we are in August, and we're voting for a reserve fund transfer when clearly there's substantial monies available in the budget. And usually, of course, we wouldn't be doing any type of these transfers until sometime in the spring or early summer. So I do understand and recognize kind of the oddity of all this. That being said, I agree with Louise to the extent she agrees, and I fully agree with John. Thanks.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to wish Louise good luck on the minutes for that statement.
Okay, if there's no other discussion, then we'll come to the vote. Louise's motion is to approve the reserve fund transfer the request in the amount of $50,000 rather than the requested $75,000. I'll take a roll call. John.
Yes.
Tom.
Yes.
Dick.
Yes.
Rick.
Yes.
Carol.
Yes.
Barry.
Yes.
Louise.
No.
Jim.
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. So it passes. Yeah, Dave, if you could send that over, I'll DocuSign that.
Thank you, Mr.
everyone.
Chair and members of the committee. We will get to work.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
So the committee is now going to just discuss more generally the Emory Grover School Administration Building. This is just kind of a fallout from the previously mentioned Facility Finance Committee discussions. As a brief background, I think it's fair to say the Finance Committee members have been vocal that if not all projects can be completed in a way that keeps borrowing costs within the town's debt limit, our preference is that the reconstruction and renovation of Pollard and Mitchell take priority over the reconstruction and renovation of Emory Grover. But there's some disagreements among the boards. And I just noticed last night, the select board opened the warrant for the October special town meeting. And there's a draft article there for an appropriation for design funds for Emory Grover. So I just thought this would be a good time to discuss among the committee if there is a position that we want to take or some way to express our opinion on the matter.
So if I could go first, and I've been a part of the meetings this summer with Josh and Barry and Carol and others on the call. I don't think that there's any disagreement that we should be moving people out of that building as soon as possible. And I think it's all agreed that no matter what the ultimate plan is, the initial place that the school administration folks are going to go to is Hillside. And so I think we should be going full steam ahead with getting the plan ready for occupancy of the building, of the Hillside building by the school administration folks. Not saying that it's going to be forever, but also recognizing that it's most likely going to be at least a 5-year plan, 5 years. And so let's get going on that because I don't think there's any disagreement on that. There is disagreement, I think, on whether the preferred or the option that has been stated by the school committee as approved as preferred for Emory Grover with the reconstruction and the addition is the correct project ultimately, and the correct project to go first ultimately. And rather than kind of, have that debate, right? That debate I think is going to go on for a while. And I think there's things that need to be looked at, such as I understand that an RFP was put out there or is going to be put out there for what leasing options might be available. I know for one that I can't make a decision on this until I see what the results of that are. To getting a firm understanding of the actual space requirements and whether a 3-story addition onto the existing square footage of that building is warranted and worth the cost in light of the other projects that we have in front of us, both within the schools and outside of the schools. So I think there's, at least for me, more to go on whether the option preferred by the school committee is the correct one. But what isn't in dispute is that in the first instance, the place for folks to go to is Hillside. And so I want to get on that and get the planning for that going and get the funding for that going so we can have people moved in there as very quickly as we can after police and fire vacate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. And just for clarification, I think the article, the draft article for the special town meeting warrant includes design funds for Emory Grover, but also a portion of those funds would be used to design Hillside for the temporary housing of school administration in the event that Emory Grover is rebuilt.
Yeah, so what I would like actually is a warrant article for the design and construction costs to move Emory Grover people into Hillside as soon as possible.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Rick, go ahead.
I couldn't agree with John more. I would certainly agree that the school administration should not have to spend any more time than they absolutely have to in that building. The 3rd floor is condemned, it leaks, it's cold, it's not right. And every movement should be in the direction of making Hillside ready for them to be there. Moving to my second point, I don't have any desire at all to spend one more penny of taxpayer money, either in the renovation and or reconstruction of the Emory Grover site. That's going to be a conversation that's going to take place down the road, but it's once again a single source building, and it's extremely expensive, especially in a post-pandemic world, for an office, to build a new office building when Lord knows there's stuff around. And then lastly, I think we should take a lead from what we just did in Ridge Hill. We took a dilapidated building, studied it, and decided to tear it down because we weren't going to spend any more money to restore it to its original glory. I think the same kind of mindset should be spent when it comes to talking about Emory Grover, and I know emotions are high. And then lastly, I would agree with John. I think the article as it appears in the warrant should be removed, and one should put in its place that specifically directs funds, whatever they be needed for, engineering, reconstruction, whatever, to make Emory Grover ready. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Does anyone else from the Finance Committee have any comments? Barry?
I think I don't disagree with anything that's been said to date. I think one of the frustrations that I have is, I think, and honestly, I think it will be an issue if this comes before town meeting. And that's something that we haven't discussed a lot about in terms of rethinking the delivery of services by the school administration department in potentially alternative ways that doesn't require as much physical space, or maybe utilizing space in a couple different places for different purposes. And what I haven't seen today, I don't think what's been thought about enough, is what those alternatives how that could look like. And I know we've had some discussion about, the way the services, the programming for administration is done, but I think it really, in this sort of reimagined service society and what's going on with most everybody that lives in this town that isn't, most people are in a service business, then in their lives and their work environments have changed dramatically. I think there's an expectation, and I think we have to keep that in mind, that something like this, which is purely administrative, and I realize there are a lot of town-facing departments within the school administration, but I also think there should be more thought put into how those services can be delivered in an alternative way that doesn't require as much physical space and certainly not one standalone physical building solely for that purpose. I just think we owe it to the town in the expectations of people at town meeting to think about that and study that a little bit more. Having said that, certainly in the near term, the solutions that have been discussed about Hillside seem the most appropriate. And I would be all for focusing all our efforts and resources in making that happen as soon as possible.
Thanks, Barry. If there aren't any other finance committee members who wish to speak, I'll call on Connie. Oh, you're on mute now.
I've muted myself. It's hard. I think the school administration is willing certainly to look at what needs to be in a building together for collaboration reasons, and because a lot of the school administration offices are customer facing. We need to have people able to access that building for transportation, for human resources, for registration, for, Dan could probably name nutrition services. It can be more articulate about this. But I think to assume that it's office work being done and that it can be spread out is making an assumption that's not accurate. Using several different places for our various school administration to separating them will not allow for necessary collaboration day in and day out that's needed. That's one of the big things I see. So I think Dan can speak to this right afterwards. I think everyone in school administration is very willing to look at what the possibilities are, but to assume that we can divide into several different offices, perhaps you would ask town administration to do that, perhaps not, but I think to assume that is not correct. And to not realize that a lot of what's happening in that building is people facing and not just office work or work on the computer, or that Zoom is going to be adequate all the time. Dan, I think, can speak to this more in a more articulate fashion.
Thank you, Connie. I think right now the suggestions are not to spread out the work of the school administration into several buildings. I think the immediate, what I'm hearing is that getting the focus should be on getting people out of Emory Grover because the conditions don't look good in that building, and the building that seems available at the moment is Hillside. I personally have a problem with prioritizing prioritizing the Emory Grover rebuild before the school buildings. I think that doesn't look very good. If we are able to house the school administration at Emory Grover for a period of time until we have a more permanent plan that fits within the debt sustainability guidelines, then I think we can discuss that. But I feel like we've kind of hit a wall where we're at a point where we can't do all these projects at once. And for some reason, we've decided to go ahead with Emory Grover, but not with the schools. And that feels wrong to me. Are there any other comments, Dick?
Yeah, just as a sort of a follow-up to Connie's statement, there is in the FAQs, there is a recitation of the, what essential services are provided in the Emory Grover building, and there's a listing. I think what would be helpful, some of them clearly require our customer facing and collaboration is important. Others seem less so. So I think it would be very helpful to go down those, prioritizing in terms of public facing and so forth, but also how many persons are involved in the respective functions so that we get a sense of how much space would be devoted to printing, mailing, distribution, and receivables. It strikes me that can be done anywhere. That's not particularly customer facing, and how much space would be allocated to that. And that would be, I think, helpful in making the determination as to whether or not some, my term, not a correct term, outsourcing makes sense or not.
Thank you, Dick. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I just want to, Josh, I agree with you. I have a hard time prioritizing Emory Grover, particularly with the ability to make Hillside ready. Add on top of that, the issue of the financing for all these buildings that we're talking about, Pollard, Mitchell, and Emory Grover. And then add on the issue that Barry brought up, which is we're not sure how office work is going to pan out over the next 2 or 3 years as COVID hopefully gets behind us. So I think the idea is that everybody said is getting Hillside ready. I think we're all in agreement. Emory Grover is not suitable. Get Hillside ready, let them do their work. We'll figure out our financing plan. And at the same time, we'll be able to see what happens in the service industry and offices and maybe have a better idea of how the school administration will be able to interface with the community as much or as little as they need to. So I am certainly in favor of the suggestions of having the warrant article focus on Hillside and putting Emory Grover aside for the time being.
Thanks, Tom. Dan, go ahead.
Well, I know, Mr. Chair, you wanted to hear from the Finance Committee, so I'll just try to, what I wanted to do was update you on where we are at with the school administration planning, and I'll be happy to do that when you think it's the right time to do so.
Okay, so I'll come back to you. I guess to respond to many of the other members, it sounds like there's a strong desire to prioritize getting school administration out of Emory Grover and maybe just going full steam ahead with the design and construction funding of Hillside for that purpose. The only way I can see doing that is actually having the Finance Committee sponsor an article in the warrant. I mean, I think it can be done. I can confer with the town moderator. Is that a plan that people agree with pursuing, or is there another way that we think we can achieve that?
I think we should put a hold on that, Josh. I think that this requires a little bit more discussion than doing it on August 18th. So I know you're trying to look for definiteness, but I'm not prepared to make such a definite position right now. I would also ask this question, which I know other people have raised, but it might be something we can discuss at a future meeting. But at what point do we practically consider that Hillside in the future may become the new administration building, at least as an option? So I think at least those are my comments. Thanks, Josh.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So I agree tonight, there's not something we can vote on. I just wanted to get the sense of how we move this forward. Dick, go ahead. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Did anyone else have anything, Barry?
Yeah, I think actually Hank may have been wanting to address this. We did, as part of the study that was done originally by the working group, which came up with the ultimate recommendation, we did look at Hillside's alternative. I think financially it wasn't materially different than rebuilding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Hank, than rebuilding at Emory Grover in terms of cost. That's just my recollection. But anyway, that's not for tonight, but just to quickly respond to Jim's comment.
Okay, thanks, Barry.
So can I say something? I've now lost my image, but
Go
so
ahead, Louise.
I think in terms of comfort level, I am not as comfortable with the Finance Committee bringing article to town meeting. I would hope that we could work something with the school committee and the Board of Selectmen. That's my only comment.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, so I think that's, I guess, the Finance Committee's comments for now. Dan, did you want to give an update?
Yeah, If I could, and thanks for, struggling through all of this. First of all, I think I've sent out, and Louise Misgard will have to correct me if I'm wrong, an invite for folks to come and visit the EG building over the next couple of weeks. And, aside from really the first couple of days of school, we can be very flexible with that for those of you who haven't been there for a while. Some of you have been there a lot. But if you want to, Ann and I will maybe through Louise, we're going to have some select board members tour next week, but we certainly can do that and make that available to you. John mentioned this. I think John mentioned this. We do have out on the street a request for leasing information, and that's or just about on the street. We anticipate that Ann generally. I'm going to have to ask her in the moment because I'm not sure.
This week, it'll be out by the end of the week.
Okay, out by the end of the week. And the idea there, again, from the facilities working group is, okay, we already have some leasing information that was part of the study. This was to see, okay, 6 months later, a year later, what does it look like now in this environment that we're talking about? One of the potential spots was PTC, but that is now being leased, so that's unavailable. But we want to see if something else is opened up. And I also, I want to caution here that I would recommend that if there were a leased site available and the town wanted to commit to that, it's got to be a practically placed venue and not far flung. But you do what you can do, and I think we have to be thoughtful and reasonable there too. So we are pursuing additional information on the lease as requested. The other thing that we're doing is we are looking at the program itself and the scope. I will say that, yes, the pandemic has changed the work world for many people, typically those in the corporate world, perhaps in finance, maybe in higher education, but it has not really changed the work world for government and for schools. We were during the pandemic and we remain fully open and staffed. The pandemic didn't really change that, except initially when everything was shut down. So there will always be opportunities to think creatively about remote opportunities, and we are a service-oriented school operations building, and we need space with people to interact with the public and staff and students. I don't see that changing. However, we are looking at the total scope of what we have proposed to see if it's possible to scale back, to minimize the overall footprint, which would lower costs, of course, and try to be really thoughtful. And a lot of that's precipitated by your comments and the pandemic. One area that I want to look at is instructional technology. And so we're having those meetings this week. BH+A has weighed in on some ideas, and I'm meeting with staff actually tomorrow to review our program needs to see what really, if we had to, if we had to reconsider, what would that look like? And I'll share that information with you. But I want to go further. We are also going to bring on board someone for short dollars that we're going to try to scrape together. We've held back on our school budgets. We've held back, all of our schools are holding back money because of some unknowns with COVID. And we're going to bring on board a consultant who's going to help us look at the future of work. And this is going to be a quick turnaround time, but they're going to provide some ideas for what is going on regarding government and school-related work and operations. And are we thinking creatively enough so that the building we want to build is the one that will make sense now and in the future? That's an imperfect science, I'm sure, but it's something that I know you and members of the facilities working group have encouraged us to do. So we will pursue that. I appreciate the thinking around Hillside. I think Hillside, as I've said time and again, can be an appropriate temporary site. I will also tell you, I will not recommend to the school committee they consider anything regarding Hillside that has an extended or an indefinite timeline. That's really trading the really bad for the bad. And I'm not going to recommend that. However, in the short term, and the short term can be flexible, of course, it absolutely would make sense. And it doesn't make sense to invest any more in that building than we absolutely need to. The draft article that you saw, I was unaware of this, that the town manager had shared that. The school committee has yet to even review that. So I'm sorry that happened for you and for the school committee. That is a draft. We have a really quick turnaround time, as you know, for special town meeting. The school committee would have to review something and vote on it rather quickly. They will be meeting next Thursday to discuss it. You will recall that last May, the school committee told town meeting that they would come back in the fall with a request for design funds. And so I will be recommending an article to them for their consideration. And to the point made earlier, it's going to require some conversation and maybe some agreements about what makes the most sense. So I know the school committee will certainly be open to that as you move forward. So more work ahead for the school operations and administration building for sure. And it will come. I guess the best way to say it's going to come out in the wash over the next couple of months. And we will certainly keep you posted and engaged in helping us try to solve through this problem.
Thanks for that update, Dan. Hank, I know you've been waiting for a while, so go ahead.
Yes, I think that you present us jumping from one conundrum to another. In our preliminary discussions with the building inspector, building commissioner, he was willing to look at interim use, short-term use of Hillside. He would not, for instance, allow use of it for education again, unless all of the necessary upgrades were made. So we're moving, as Dan said, from worst to maybe bad, but like Emory Grover, the Hillside would have to be, if it is going to be looked at for a 5-year temporary solution, we would be forced to look at the structural upgrades necessary, similar to what we did at Newman. We would be forced, I think, to look at the possibility of including an elevator. We would be forced to look at replacing, I think, all of the heating system within the building. They are currently, well, they didn't have heat until early December in the building this past year. And we would likely have to look, the only air conditioning within the building, because it was only used during the school year, are the window rattlers that are currently in each classrooms. So I think that if we are looking truly at a 5-year plan, we might be forced to do that, plus somehow try to fit in sprinklering within the building. So it would likely be a much more expensive option than what would be a 2-year temporary.
I understand. Thank you, Hank. Do we have exact cost estimates for that, out of curiosity, to compare with a full rebuild of Emory Grover?
I would have to look back through probably all the way back to the 2013 Dora Whittier study to see their analysis of the existing building to bring it up to code. And then we could use that as a reference point and then escalate those numbers from there. I would also remind the committee that it does still have an environmental issue, a spill that has been there for over 25 years and is still being mitigated. And that system continues to operate, but it continues to be an issue.
Thanks for that update. Jim, I think you were next.
Yeah, listen, if Hillside's not the answer, it's not the answer. I just raised it as a possibility that perhaps should be re-examined. But if the answer is it's not the answer, then fine, take it off the table. I don't agree with Dan. I work at the UMass Medical School, and we have a substantial number of our people who are working remotely, not people facing, and it's working well. And so when you say that you haven't seen this in the government, you haven't seen this in education, I can tell you for a fact that it's happening right now at UMass Medical School in Worcester. The only thing that, again, Dan talked about frustration earlier. So I've had frustration. You know what my frustration is? That the Board of Selectmen comes out with an article in the special town meeting and then expects us to jump and take a position and be prepared to either defend or refute within a very short window. That's frustrating to me. That's not the process that should be envisioned. It's not how the Board of Selectmen should lead. So listen, I started this conversation about, an hour ago, saying I really wanted to move forward on this. And I do want to move forward, but I want to move forward without obstacles. And I want to move forward without people trying to throw in obfuscation and these thoughts that really are not getting us to a solution. So I'm not prepared to take any stance tonight, Josh, on what we should or should not do with respect to that warrant article. I do agree with Louise. I think that the Finance Committee proposing an article should only be done in very limited and narrow circumstances. And hopefully we'll have some discussions, open discussions, so people can actually weigh in very shortly so that we know what it is we should or should not be supporting come the special town meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Jim. I guess in fairness to the select board, I think the draft warrant is quite similar to what was in a previous capital plan. So I don't think it was a complete surprise that it was there. And my intention to have this discussion wasn't to take a position on that particular article because the warrant hasn't even closed. It was really just to discuss Emory Grover. Is this, does the Finance Committee want to take a position at all about whether Emory Grover in general needs to have a different priority relative to the other school building projects? That was really the purpose of the conversation.
I would move forward with both schools before Emory Grover, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Rick or John, I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
I'll go just be quickly. One, I agree with that. I would go with the schools always before the Emory Grover, but I do think we can get people in. Just Emory Grover Hillside was used for children for a long period of time, right up until recently, up until they moved over to Sunita Williams. And it's been used by the police and fire since then. I'm not advocating that it go there permanently, but I think we can put our problem-solving hats on and work with the building inspector and work collectively to come up with a program that will make that building suitable and safe for a period of 3 to 5 years while we sort out whether Emory Grover is the right place and what the process for Mitchell and Pollard is going to be. I think we can solve that problem, and I want to get going with solving that problem for Hillside for that time period, and I want to get going on it this fall.
Thanks, John. Rick, did you have something you want to say?
I would just reiterate what John said. I think we need to try and remove as many obstacles as we can to make that building work in the short term, because they really can't stay at Emory. And I too would put the two school buildings prior to the reconstitution of Emory at any rate.
Thanks, Rick. So I guess our desires have been voiced, and I think you've heard them. If Dan, you're able to get some answers to Dick's questions about proportions of space used for community space versus office space, I think that might also be helpful. Anne, go ahead.
Sure. In the Emory Grover study, there was a section of the report that was actually the detail behind the program of spaces, and it identified the square feet, the spaces, the amount allocated to copiers, and the number of individuals that would be in each space. So that information is actually right in the study.
Thank you.
I have this, do you know whereabouts in the study it is? Because it's impossible for me to find it. So if you could, you don't have to get to us now, but if you could just refer to the page numbers and send that to us, Ann, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're a bit over. Is there anyone else for the Finance Committee or School Department that wants to say something? Okay. Well, thank you for your time again. I guess we'll move to the last issue on the agenda. Issues not Finance Committee updates or issues not anticipated. I don't have any. Are there any Finance Committee members who have any updates or issues they want to raise? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to congratulate John Conley, whose daughter got married last week and whose other daughter is engaged. So let's leave on a good note tonight and say, God bless them.
That's
Thank you,
very
Jim.
kind of you, Jim. Thank you.
Bless them.
Good
And
news
with
is
that,
always
Mr.
welcome.
I make a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
A motion and second. John, roll
Aye.
call.
Yes. And thank you.
Tom,
Yes.
Dick,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
and the chair votes yes.
And I do too.
Louise, excellent.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.